Late night TV in South Korea very suddenly became very serious.
저는 북한 공산
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces.
South Korea's president declared martial law, basically in the middle of the night, effectively accusing the opposition of trying to destroy the country from within.
I have to stress that this is a shocking development. Nobody expected that.
We understand that it would prohibit political activity.
Protests are prohibited and the media is censored.
It was a complete shock. I don't think any Koreans would accept that.
The president says the opposition is undermining core functions of government, turning the country into a drug haven, putting public safety into a state of chaos. These are all his words, not mine.
And I will definitely eradicate the anti-state forces who are the main culprit of the country's ruination and conduct vicious activities.
And then, almost as quickly as the declaration had been made, Parliament, including members of the president's own party, pulled the rug out from under it, reversing the call.
South Korean lawmakers were able to convene tonight and vote unanimously.
Martial law and military rule declared by President Yoon earlier in the day have now been lifted.
A lot of people are scratching their heads, and there's a big question mark. Why did the president, made this, announcement?
The more I read into this story, I very quickly realized that this is just the latest in a series of bizarre events in South Korean politics. Because for years, the land of Samsung and semiconductors has been locked into an all-out political war, with the president repeatedly facing impeachment, an opposition leader who was nearly killed by being stabbed in the neck, a parliament unable to agree on a path forward, and somehow, this also involves a very expensive Dior handbag and green onions. Lots of green onions. Let's dive in. When South Korea's president made an offhand remark about produce at a grocery store, he had no idea how such a small thing would spin out of control. President Yoon visited a food market and marveled at how reasonably priced the spring onions were. And they were, something like 875 won, or about 86 cents in today's Canadian dollars. But this was a heavily discounted price because of a government subsidy, and green onions were normally 3, 4, 5 times that price. All food in South Korea has become increasingly expensive, and this quip from the president felt, to many voters, hopelessly out of touch.
Opposition candidates started bringing spring onions to election rallies and accusing the president of being out of touch with reality.
Powerful symbol, those green onions. And ahead of an election, voters had a clear outlet for their anger.
He had the narrowest margin of victory in the history of the vote by less than 1%.
And he actually enters office with the lowest approval rating of any new president here in South Korea.
The 2022 election that saw Yoon narrowly win the presidency was also a crushing defeat. His opponents won parliament, and that all but neutralized any hope of achieving the agenda that he had laid out. Now, to be sure, of course, this wasn't just about green onions, but even in the most recent elections, this past April, the opposition increased their majority. Yoon's party leader resigned. The prime minister offered to do the same, and South Korean politics would become so bitter that on the very day marking the reopening of parliament this past September, Yoon just refused to show up. A president failing to attend the opening of parliament? That hadn't happened in 30 plus years. But Yoon was frustrated. Calls for his impeachment had been building momentum. Here's a petition dated just a couple of months after the most recent elections, 2 years since Yoon took office. It's in Korean, but 2 things I'll point out. These characters here, 탄핵, that's Korean for impeachment. But importantly, look at how many people signed. More than 1.4 million people.
The president is deeply unpopular and has been unwilling to compromise to deal with the opposition and to focus on cost of living issues that a majority of Koreans are worried about.
He's been facing so many calls for impeachment, not only from the public, but from other politicians. And this was actually something that he had cited in his reasoning for declaring martial law.
Yoon saw this as the opposition weaponizing its majority, weaponizing the system against him, and eventually his wife, too.
Now, the bag scandal, as the incident is being called, is sending shockwaves through President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration.
A scandal erupted when Yoon's wife was captured with a hidden camera accepting a Dior handbag as a gift. This, under South Korean law, is illegal because public officials and their spouses can't accept gifts worth more than $750 US. She was interrogated by prosecutors. The president apologized for her error, even called it reckless, but accused the opposition of blowing the whole thing out of proportion.
First Lady Kim Gon-hee received a Dior handbag, which led to accusations of violating the anti-corruption law.
President Yoon was a prosecutor for 25 years. He's supposed to be really tough on corruption and on crime. But of course, he's also extremely wealthy. And his answer to those allegations was that she behaved badly, right? So he dismissed it. He didn't take it seriously.
The opposition, by the way, has had problems of their own. And it was earlier this year, the opposition leader only barely survived an attempt on his life. This summer, a man was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempting to kill opposition leader Jae-myung. He was apparently pretending to ask for an autograph, but instead, and just a warning, you're going to see it happen here, he lunges at Lee with a knife, stabbing him in the neck. Lee needed surgery, was in hospital for 8 days. He survived, but almost a full year later, he'd face a different sort of reckoning, a 1-year prison term for making false statements before the 2022 elections. But he would claim, in effect, what the president has claimed, that the system was being weaponized against him. In a statement online, his party wrote, "Today's first trial verdict is clearly a political verdict," and that this was an attempt by the Yoon administration to eliminate its political enemies. The opposition leader plans to appeal. But this is how polarized politics have become in South Korea. It's all personal.
South Korea historically, certainly for the last 40 plus years, has been seen as a strong liberal democracy in Asia. It's obviously a sign of the times that we're living in terms of disinformation, polarization, and divisions within democracies.
Starting out the year with an assassination attempt, I think really highlighted the discontent with politicians in general that we are seeing in South Korea.
But even after all this, it seems the direct trigger for Yoon declaring martial law is something else altogether, an impasse in parliament over his party's budget. The opposition wanted to slash trillions of won, that's equal to billions of Canadian dollars, out of the budget. And because the opposition has a majority, they were looking to force their amendments through. The parliamentary speaker has urged both parties to come to an agreement by next week, but it doesn't seem like the president sees a path forward.
President Yoon's speech declaring martial law also used some really inflammatory language, accusing the opposition of being essentially working in collaboration with North Korean communists and being enemies of the state. The opposition has made it clear that the president and the party are incompetent, that they're corrupt, that they're elite, and they have been calling for them to step down and to essentially call for fresh elections.
As Yoon himself faces accusations of corruption and being unfit to lead, he sees the opposition and its majority as tyrannical, putting the country on a dangerous path. But his problem is his own party, too.
The National Assembly demanded the lifting of martial law, so the troops deployed for martial law affairs were withdrawn. Martial law will be lifted immediately by accepting the National Assembly's request through a state council meeting.
Over the course of a few hours, he declared martial law, sent South Koreans and the world into a confused frenzy, and then backtracked on it. So not a good look for him.
The president appears increasingly isolated. His last-ditch effort to grab hold of the reins of power rebuffed by his own party allies. His approval ratings have never been lower, and now it's not clear what, if any, agency or legitimacy the president has left.